Hello Dungeons & Dragons players, welcome to my special background video on lycanthropes. One of the many types of monsters in Dungeons & Dragons. Now the motivation for this video was that my player characters came upon and met an NPC named Juliana. She was a tabaxi, a catfolk individual, and she was coming to a secluded location to ride out the more difficult nights of her ways. She said she is some kind of shapeshifter, and she said she was tracking a group of jackal-wares. Now, my realization was a lot of my players were looking at me like I'd speaking in Greek all of a sudden. I realized it's just because a lot of the ideas we take for granted, they may not have a background in. So to this video, I'm going to explain some of the background of this type of monster and possible interactive effort. Lycanthropy is a disease, a bloodborne disease, that creates shape-changing creatures. Lycanthropes are the wide variety of actual creatures infected with lycanthropy. This, if you want a good movie example, a lot of the underworld movies, you get vampires versus lycans, basically werewolves versus vampires, gives you an idea of the basics of this whole thing. Now, one of the things that is in Dungeons and Dragons but is not apparent is that lycanthropes have a pecking order based on strength. Not all lycanthropes, not all lycans are equally feared or part of their sort of shape-changing societies. What Juliana was tracking, the jackal-ware, it really is the bottom rung of the lycanthrope pecking order. Their animal form that their lycanthropy turns them from is basically a jackal. A sort of scavenger. And they are the weakest of all the lycanthropes. They have part of the problem is they are much more feral in nature. They're not as smart and cunning as some of their larger, more dangerous brethren. Next up the rung, about equally difficult, are your evil lycanthropes. And this is the classic werewolf that most people are familiar with from television, movies, and other venues. There's also the were-rat, sort of a long-standing Dungeons and Dragons trope. If you go to a major city and you go into the sewers, you will often run into a were-rat colony living beneath the city. Now, these both are stronger than the jackal-wares, and they are difficult for adventurers to deal with because they, have multiple forms they can take. There's only special items that can hurt them. And last but not least, though, there are neutral and good lycanthropes. Were-tigers and were-bears. Now, one of the things, were-tigers and were-bears are the strongest lycanthropes you will find. They are far more powerful one-on-one than any of the previous versions. However, they also are fewer and farther between in numbers, where you may run into a pack, half a dozen jackal-wares, you may only find one or two were-tigers. Now, one last note on lycanthropes in general and this disease of lycanthropy. What you see here are the most common archetypes of lycanthropes, the ones that most people have heard of, rumors of, but the reality is that lycanthropy can infect anyone. Any person you run into in any city, town, or village could have the disease and have an ability to change into beast form. The other thing is that as long as it's a beast, lycanthropes could tie to that beast form. So these are just some of the big archetypes. There are certainly others out there. With that, I want to throw out a piece of gaming advice for those who are, newer players. Use your knowledge. One of the things I always impress is that Dungeons and Dragons is a mashup. It begs, borrows, and steals from literature, mythology, etc. What you know about real world mythology is often true in Dungeons and Dragons settings. A lot of what werewolf mythology that you are familiar with comes about and works in Dungeons and Dragons setting. And this is true for things like vampires, from the Eastern Europe, Count Dracula and all that. If you want to go Greek, Medusa, the Hydra, all those sort of creatures and monsters are straight out of those mythologies, are just converted, and much of their abilities and characteristics that they had in mythology are just translated into Dungeons and Dragons. And with that, that wraps up this brief video explaining the Lycan monsters of Dungeons and Dragons.